I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Michael Sculley. He is an alumnus of LAC, Lilburn Academic Classes, which of course is now known as EAS, East Side Academic Studies. Thank you for wearing the sweatshirt so I can read that right over there. So I'm going to let Michael tell you a little bit about himself before he launches into his talk, so go for it.
Okay, so I'm a third-year student at Tacoma Falls College. It's a college in North Georgia, and I'm majoring in philosophy there. And while I was here, I took karate, and I took Miss Schumann's AP Lit class. I think it was in this room, or it was like somewhere on this hall while I was here. Okay, so I'm going to be giving a brief history of philosophy. And, okay, so philosophy was started because people wanted to learn about the universe through reason, and they wanted to understand why things happened. For example, in Greece, when the Greeks saw lightning, they would say that it was caused by Zeus, and they wouldn't try to understand why it happened. But the philosophers wanted to understand why things happened. And the first philosophers, they were considered to be the first scientists as well, and like some of them were astronomers and some were engineers as well. Now, the first one was called Thales, and he tried to find a theory which would unite everything together. And he thought that was water, that water was the element which would hold everything together. And one of the other things which Thales did was he predicted when a solar eclipse would take place during his own lifetime, and no one today even knows how he did it. And there were many other philosophers who came after him, and they all tried to explain how the universe works, and they were all called the pre-Socratic philosophers, even though some of them were alive at the same time as Socrates. Now, Greek philosophy, like what we consider philosophy today, was started by Socrates. And Socrates is considered the philosopher which everyone else is sort of supposed to model their philosophy after. And he became known during his own lifetime for asking people questions until they didn't know how to answer him, and until either they just got annoyed and left because he would never stop asking them questions. And he was always his goal in philosophy was to help people to understand that humans were foolish and that only God is truly wise. And that another thing he said was that human wisdom begins when a person realizes that they are foolish, and that the only way that we can gain wisdom is by being humble. One of the things that he's famous for saying is, "No, gentlemen, the difficult thing is not to escape death, I think, but to escape wickedness. That is much more difficult, for that runs faster than death." Now, one of Socrates' students, his most famous one, was Plato. And Plato wrote down all of the conversations which Socrates had with other people. And these conversations have been called Plato's dialogues, and there's about 30 of them. And Plato was the first philosopher who started a school of philosophy, which was called a university, and he started this in Athens. And the university, people learned about philosophy, public speaking, art, music, writing, and many other things. And one of the things which Plato said was, "God delights in altars on which no fire is burned, but around which virtue dances." And if you want to read more philosophy, I would recommend that you start with Plato, because most of what Plato wrote were dialogues, and they're all fairly easy to understand, for the most part. And Plato, one of his students was Aristotle. And Aristotle learned at Plato's University in Athens. And one of the things which Aristotle is well known for is he said that a person is a body and a soul, And while Plato said that a person is just a soul, and that the body was evil. How do I start that?
Yeah, here you can control those. So, just press enter, and then it should come up with a menu. Point it at the box. Point it at the little box. Press that middle of that little. Point it at the box. Okay, push it again. And then again, it should come into your menu. No, you have to push USB device. It should be on USB device. Go down to USB device. Use the down arrow, I think.
Yeah, it's not working.
Use the down arrow. You have to point it at the box. I don't know how to do it any better than that. Maybe Esther can do it from there. Oh, here.
Yeah, it's not working.
Is it not? Let's see. Maybe it can. What format is this in on here?
MP4, I think.
Okay, it's not even reading it.
Oh, okay. Well, that's
Okay.
all. That's all right.
Well, isn't this part of your talk then?
It's not extremely important, no.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
No,
Well, okay. So the video talked about some of what Aristotle did. So another thing which Aristotle is well known for is the idea that happiness is always pursued for its own benefit, and this means that people aren't happy so that they can get things, but the people get things to try to become happy. And this is what he said about happiness. Happiness is something final and complete in itself, as being the aim and end of all practical activities. Happiness, then, we define as the active exercise of the mind in conformity with perfect goodness or virtue. And there were many other Greek philosophers after them, but I'm going to skip into Roman philosophy. So the main purpose of Roman philosophy was for people to live a virtuous life as individuals and as a community. And Roman philosophy was mostly about trying to live the best possible life for each person, and also to try to find the best possible government for everyone. And there were three main groups of Roman philosophy, three main schools. They were, technically these are Greek philosophies which the Romans took over when they invaded Greece. Okay, there's Epicureanism, Stoicism, and Neoplatonism. Epicureanism was founded by Epicurus, and the goal of Epicureanism was trying to live the best possible life by not having anything in excess. This means that people should not have more than is necessary for their lives, but that they should live a life of moderation. And according to Epicurus, this will help people to control their desires so that they can focus on growing in virtue. One of the things which Epicurus said was, "Do not spoil what you have by desiring what you have not. Remember that what you now have, was once among the things you only hoped for." And when this philosophy started in Greece, it was actually really good. But then when the Romans took over Greece, they read about this philosophy, and they sort of thought that that you could do whatever you wanted to as long as you enjoyed it, and then that kind of destroyed the philosophy. The next one is Stoicism, and it says that virtue which is the highest good, is based on knowledge, and that the wise live in harmony with the divine reason that governs nature, and meaning that the divine reason they believed was God. and that they were not to be worried about fortune, pleasure, or pain. And three famous Stoic philosophers were Marcus Aurelius, who was a Roman emperor, Seneca, who was, I think he was a slave, and Cicero, who was a spokesperson. And Marcus Aurelius was the only reason that he is known in Roman philosophy is because he wrote a book called the Meditations, which is a book about how to live a practical life, and it's become very well known. Cicero said that to study philosophy is nothing but to prepare oneself to die, and even people like Plato and Socrates said that philosophy is a way of preparing yourself for death. Neoplatonism, the only thing that I know about it is that it was a religion which was based on Plato's philosophy, and it developed during the first 200 years of Christianity. Now, in early Christianity, Christians debated about whether or not they should learn philosophy, and there were three different views which they came up with on whether or not Christians should learn philosophy. And these views were developed by the Church Fathers, who were the earliest Christian theologians. One view said that all philosophy was evil, and that it should not be learned by any Christian. One Church Father who held to this view was Tertullian. Another view was that all philosophy was good, and that every philosopher was in heaven, and one Church Father who held to this view was Origen of Alexandria. And the last view was that philosophy was not evil, nor was every philosopher in heaven, but that pre-Christian philosophers, meaning the Greeks and the Roman philosophers, got some things right and some things wrong. And Christians can agree with the things which they got right and build on those things. And this view was held by philosophers like Justin Martyr and Augustine. Now, I'm just going to briefly quote both of these people. Augustine said, "You never judge a philosophy by its abuse," meaning that if a philosophy if when used properly, it's a good philosophy, and then it is used poorly, you don't judge the philosophy by it being used poorly. You judge it by how it's supposed to be used. And Justin Martyr, he briefly talked about his conversion, and he said, "But straightway a flame was kindled in my soul, and a love of Christ possessed me. I found this philosophy alone to be safe and profitable. Thus and for this reason I am a philosopher." And what he meant is basically that believing in God expanded his philosophy instead of decreasing it. Now, after that, there was medieval Christian philosophy, and this medieval Christian philosophy was generally about proving that God exists, explaining the nature of God, like explaining what it means for God to be all-powerful and things of that sort, and talking about the relationship between our free will and God's foreknowledge, and discussing the problem of evil. Three philosophers who were three well-known philosophers during this time period, or the three influential philosophers during this time period, were Boethius, who was a Christian philosopher and theologian, and he had a major influence on medieval philosophy. And in his book, The Consolation of Philosophy, he discusses the main topics in medieval philosophy and how to live a virtuous life. One of the things that Boethius said in his book was, "Indeed, the condition of human nature is just this. Man towers above the rest of creation so long as he realizes his own nature, and when he forgets it, he sinks lower than the beasts. For other living things to be ignorant of themselves is natural, but for man it is a defect." Another philosopher was St. Anselm, and one thing that Anselm did was he famously said that, "I do not seek to understand in order to believe, but I believe in order to understand. For I believe this, unless I believe, I will not understand." And another philosopher during this time period was Thomas Aquinas, and he's probably the most influential philosopher during this time period. And he's famous for writing a huge book called Summa Theologica, which basically explains pretty much everything that Christians need to believe through philosophical arguments. And it's probably the most influential book during medieval philosophy. And two things which he said was, because philosophy arises from awe, a philosopher is bound in his way to be a lover of myths and poetic fables. Poets and philosophers are alike in being big with wonder. And something else which he said was, the contemplation of God is the highest goal in the philosophy of human reason. And after medieval philosophy, there was the Renaissance. And in the Renaissance, there was at least one very influential philosopher, and his name was William of Ockham. And he did one very good thing and one really bad thing during this time period, during his life. The good thing that he did was he made a rule in philosophy which has been called Occam's razor. And it says the explanation requiring the fewest assumptions is most likely to be correct, meaning that the simplest explanation is generally the best, and this has been very helpful in philosophy and also in science as well. One really bad thing that he did was he said that metaphysics, which is the study of reality, does not exist. Then, after the Renaissance, there was modern philosophy, and modern philosophy started with the Enlightenment. And it was started by Descartes. His full name is René Descartes. Now, Descartes said that philosophy was a science because he saw that the sciences improved through the Renaissance, but that philosophy didn't. So he tried to turn philosophy into a science during his lifetime. And one thing which Descartes is famous for saying is the phrase, "I think, therefore I am." And what this means is that you can have complete assurance that you as an individual exist, because you cannot think unless something exists to be able to think. Another influential philosopher was David Hume. Now, David Hume was an atheist, and he lived in Scotland. And during his lifetime, he attacked religion in most of his philosophy. Now, one thing which he said was he wrote at the end of one of his books, if we take in our hand any book of theology or philosophy, for instance, let us ask, does it contain any math or science? No. Commit it then to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. Basically saying, take anything that's about philosophy or theology, and if there's nothing about science or math, then destroy it. But interestingly, this phrase is itself something philosophical, not something about science or math, so he would have to destroy that as well. And there are many other famous philosophers during the modern period of philosophy, but I'll just summarize it by saying that modern philosophy was the collapse of metaphysics, and then philosophers tried to base philosophy off of their knowledge of reality instead of off of reality itself. Then, in the 20th century, metaphysics was removed from philosophy, and it was considered irrelevant by most philosophers. After this, epistemology, the study of knowledge, started to become irrelevant in philosophy as well. And once epistemology disappeared, philosophers started saying that language could mean whatever people wanted it to mean, and this led into relativism. This caused philosophy of language, which is the study of the meaning of language, to become irrelevant. And one important philosopher during this time period was Ludwig Wittgenstein. And one thing which Wittgenstein said was, a philosopher who is not taking part in discussions is like a boxer who never goes into the ring. And while philosophy was basically falling apart during the 20th century, there was a resurgence of Christian philosophy within the past 50 to 60 years. And when this happened, philosophers who became Christians saw that belief in God expanded their philosophy instead of decreasing it, like what happened in the medieval period of philosophy. Also, after that, or about 10 to 20 years ago, there was a huge conference in America where, and the topic of the conference was whether or not the focus of philosophy should be changed to something else. So people are starting to challenge whether or not the goal of philosophy should be something different. And I'll just briefly summarize everything which I've said. Philosophy was started as a way of understanding reality through reason. Greek and Roman philosophy tried to figure out how to live a virtuous life as an individual and as a community. Some early Christian philosophers saw that belief in God expanded their philosophy instead of decreasing it. The medieval Christian philosophers discussed God's existence, God's nature, the relationship between free will and God's foreknowledge, and the problem of evil. Renaissance philosophy challenged metaphysics as being something false. Modern philosophy called philosophy a science, then removed metaphysics, the study of reality, as the foundation of philosophy, and replaced it with epistemology, our knowledge of reality. 20th century philosophy challenged our knowledge of reality and said that we could not speak truthfully about reality, but that everything we say is only our personal opinion. Lastly, there was a resurgence of Christian philosophy in recent years. And this brief history of philosophy shows that belief in Jesus expands our philosophy, and that when people remove God from philosophy, it eventually becomes illogical nonsense.
Right. Good job.